They laughed at him before the engines even warmed up. Not out loud, not officially, but in that quiet way pilots judge each other with a glance. A farm boy in a Navy Corsair flying over one of the most dangerous skies of the Pacific War. Rabaul, late morning. The kind of place where men vanished without warning. The kind of place where mistakes lasted seconds. And this man, with dirt still metaphorically under his fingernails, was about to do something no one expected. Something that would confuse 11 Japanese Zeros at once. Something that would turn mockery into silence. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. It was March 1944, just after 10 a.m., and the air above New Britain was already alive with heat shimmer and distant engine noise. Rabaul harbour lay ahead, ringed by jungle-covered hills and scarred runways. For the Japanese, Rabaul was still a fortress, even as Allied pressure closed in. For American pilots, it was a trap layered with flak, fighters, and memory. Too many missions ended here. Too many didn't come back. The man in the Corsair was a U.S. Navy lieutenant junior grade, flying with a Marine fighter squadron operating from Rough Island strips. He wasn't famous. He wasn't a top ace. He didn't have a dramatic backstory written for newspapers. What he had was muscle memory built from years of flying low and slow over farmland, skimming fields, dodging trees, reading wind and ground like a second language. Before the war, he flew crop dusters. Before the uniform, he flew to survive bad weather and worse mistakes. The Vought F4U Corsair beneath him was a beast. Long nose, massive propeller, bent wings like a bird mid-dive. It was fast, powerful, and unforgiving. Many pilots struggled with it at first. Landing accidents were common. Visibility over the nose was terrible. But in the air, especially down low, it was deadly. If you knew how to fly it. If you trusted your hands more than your fear. As the flight approached Rabaul, radio chatter sharpened. Reports came in fast. Enemy fighters climbing. Zeros. A lot of them. Not 2 or 3. A full swarm. At least 11 Mitsubishi R6M Zeros lifting from nearby fields, light, agile, and hungry. The Zero was still dangerous in 1944, especially in numbers. It could turn tighter than most American fighters. It could climb fast. And its pilots knew this sky. The American formation began to spread, gaining altitude where possible. Doctrine said altitude was life. Energy was survival. But the farm boy didn't climb as hard. He watched. He felt the air. He noticed the Zeros rising unevenly, some higher, some lower, some already eager to dive. He knew what they wanted. A clean fight. A turning fight. A predictable fight. They saw him too. One Corsair slightly lower, slightly apart. Not sloppy, just different. To the Japanese pilots, it looked like hesitation. Maybe inexperience, maybe fear. One Zero peeled off first, then another. Soon more followed. The pack instinct took over. 11 Zeros shifted focus toward the lone Corsair, dropping closer to the terrain. This was where every training manual screamed danger. Low altitude meant no room to recover, no room to dive away, no room to trade speed for safety. Down low, one mistake meant the jungle, the sea, or the guns around Rabaul. Down low, the Zero felt confident. That's where it had killed before. The Corsair went lower still. Below him, the jungle canopy blurred into a green river. Palm tops whipped past. The coastline curved sharply. Anti-aircraft fire began to reach up in black bursts. But the Corsair slipped beneath much of it, fast and steady. The Zeros followed, spreading slightly, preparing to turn with him, to bleed his speed, to force him into a flat circle where numbers would decide everything. That was the moment he changed the rules. Instead of pulling up or banking hard, the Corsair levelled out, almost too level. Then it began to weave, not violently, not sharply. A gentle, rhythmic side-to-side motion, barely climbing or descending. It looked wrong. It looked careless. It looked like a farmer flying over crops, lining up a field, adjusting for wind. The Japanese pilots hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. For this wasn't a combat maneuver they recognized. It wasn't a brake turn. It wasn't a dive. It wasn't a climb. The Corsair wasn't committing to anything. It was sliding across the air, smooth and low, changing angles subtly, forcing constant adjustment. At 300 feet above the jungle, small movements matter. A tiny correction can throw off a firing solution. A slight shift can force an overshoot. The Corsair's massive engine gave it raw speed, but the pilot wasn't using brute force. He was using timing. He was using space. He was using instincts learned miles above cornfields, not clouds. The first Zero closed too fast. Its pilot had expected a hard turn or a climb. Instead, the Corsair slid sideways, just enough. The Zero flashed past, guns firing too late, tracers cutting empty air. The Corsair didn't chase. It didn't turn sharply. It stayed low and kept weaving, letting speed do the work. Two more Zeros tried next, approaching from slightly different angles. The Corsair dipped, then rose, then slid again. Not enough to lose speed, just enough to ruin aim. One Zero clipped the air wake and bounced, forced to pull up to avoid the trees. Another overshot and had to break away. Now confusion spread. 11 fighters were supposed to overwhelm one. Instead, they were stacking up behind each other, constantly adjusting, constantly missing. Down low, the Zero's strength became a weakness. Its light frame reacted quickly, sometimes too quickly. Pilots overcorrected. Sight pictures vanished. Timing slipped. The Corsair pilot waited. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't reacting emotionally. He was counting, watching spacing, feeling when one Zero committed too hard, think when another lost patience. He knew that crop dusting taught one brutal lesson. If you rush, you crash. If you overcorrect, you die. One Zero finally slowed too much, trying to turn inside the Corsair's gentle weave. That was the opening. The Corsair snapped a short, controlled turn, just enough to bring its guns to bear. A brief burst. The heavy .50 caliber machine gun spoke once. The Zero caught fire instantly and went down into the jungle without a sound. The others scattered, not far, not fully disengaging. But the confidence was gone. The pattern had broken. What should have been a clean kill zone had turned into chaos. Some Zeros climbed. Others pulled wide. One tried to dive beneath the Corsair and lost sight entirely. The Corsair didn't chase recklessly. It stayed alive. It stayed unpredictable. It used short bursts, never committing too long to one target. Another Zero took hits, smoke trailing as it limped away toward Rabaul. A third nearly collided with a wingman while trying to line up a shot that never came. Above them, the rest of the American flight saw what was happening and began to dive in. Now the fight shifted. What had started as 11 versus 1 became a broader engagement, but the damage was already done. The Zeros were disorganized. Their energy was uneven. Their timing was off. Within minutes, the sky cleared. The Corsair climbed at last, engine roaring, leaving the treetops behind. Fuel was lower, adrenaline high, hands steady. Behind him, smoke columns marked where confidence had turned into wreckage. When the flight regrouped, no one joked, no one smirked. The radio stayed quiet longer than usual. Everyone had seen it. On the low-level weaving, the impossible calm. The way 11 Zeros had been pulled down into a fight, they didn't understand. Later, back on the strip, someone finally said it, half amazed, half embarrassed. He flew it like a damn crop duster. The farm boy just shrugged. What they didn't fully understand yet was that this wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was a reminder that wars aren't won only by machines or manuals. Sometimes they're shaped by habits learned far from battlefields. Sometimes the man who knows how to fly close to the ground survives where others wouldn't. And over Rabaul that morning, a so-called farmer proved that experience doesn't always look like heroism until it's too late to laugh. The mission report that afternoon was short and factual, the way combat paperwork usually is. Time over target, enemy contact, an altitude range, ammunition expended. Nothing in the official language captured what had actually happened down low over the jungle. But pilots talk, and by sunset the story had already started moving across the strip from tent to tent, from one squadron to another. Over Rabaul, on that March morning in 1944, the air war was already tilting in favour of the Allies. Japanese fuel shortages were growing worse. Experienced pilots were harder to replace. Training hours were shrinking. But none of that meant the Zero was harmless. It was still deadly when flown with discipline and numbers. What failed that day was not the aircraft. It was expectation. Japanese pilots who survived the engagement later described confusion in their own after-action summaries. The one report mentioned an American fighter refusing combat form. Another noted erratic low-level manoeuvring inconsistent with standard doctrine. Those phrases mattered. They meant the Corsair had not behaved like an enemy aircraft was supposed to behave. In air combat, expectation is everything. Pilots don't just aim at airplanes, they aim at habits. At Rabaul, the Zero pilots expected altitude fights or diving passes. They expected Americans to avoid low-level engagements unless forced. They expected speed used in straight lines, not sideways motion hugging the terrain. What they encountered instead felt almost careless. But careless is often confused with unfamiliar. And unfamiliar is dangerous. The Corsair pilot never claimed he invented anything new. When questioned later by his squadron commander, he explained it simply. He said he flew the airplane where it felt strongest. He said he trusted the engine. He said he kept his movements small so the enemy had to guess. There was no bravado in it, no speech, just a matter-of-fact explanation shaped by years of flying where mistakes were paid for immediately. Crop dusting in the 1930s was not gentle work. Pilots flew barely above fields, threading between trees, fences and power lines. They learned to judge wind by how crops bent. They learned that smooth inputs kept you alive and sudden ones killed you. They learned that staying calm mattered more than reacting fast. Those lessons didn't disappear when the uniform went on. The Vought F4U Corsair, for all its power, rewarded exactly that kind of discipline. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could pull hard, but it could also bite if mishandled. At low altitude, the Corsair had one major advantage over the Zero. It held speed better in shallow manoeuvres. Where the Zero bled energy in constant corrections, the Corsair stayed heavy and stable. The farm boy knew this without needing charts or manuals. He felt it in the controls. Within weeks, intelligence officers took interest in the engagement, not because of the kill count, which was modest, but because of the circumstances. 11 Zeros failing to overwhelm a single aircraft at low altitude raised questions. Combat analysis teams looked at gun camera footage, flight paths, and pilot testimony. What stood out was not aggression, but restraint. The Corsair pilot had never tried to outturn the Zeros. He had never tried to climb above them. He had refused the traditional fight. Instead, he had turned the engagement into a test of patience. And patience was something Japanese fighter doctrine, by 1944, struggled with under pressure. Marine squadrons operating Corsairs in the Solomon Islands and around New Britain had already been experimenting with low-altitude tactics for ground attack and interception. But this incident reinforced a quiet truth. Down low, unpredictability mattered more than textbook maneuvers. A pilot who could control closure rate, spacing and timing could survive against superior numbers. No official memo went out titled crop dusting tactics. No manual was rewritten overnight. But instructors began telling stories. Veterans began advising new pilots to think smaller, not bigger, when trapped low. They talked about gentle movement, about letting the enemy make the mistake first, is about trusting the airplane instead of fighting it. Back at Rabaul, Japanese commanders were facing their own problems. Losses were mounting. Runways were cratered daily. Radar coverage was inconsistent. And now, American fighters were no longer predictable even when caught at low altitude. One Japanese officer reportedly noted that American pilots were learning faster than expected. That sentence carried weight. It meant the gap was widening. For the Corsair pilot himself, there was no promotion, no headline. He flew more missions. Some were routine, some were violent, a few were terrifying. Like most combat pilots, his war was a chain of moments rather than a single, defining event. But among his peers, the label stuck. The farmer in a Corsair. Not as an insult anymore, but as a marker of respect. Young pilots began asking him questions. How low was too low? How much throttle to use? When to commit and when to wait? He never gave dramatic answers. He talked about airspeed numbers, about engine sound, about keeping your head from rushing ahead of your airplane. He talked the way experienced flyers always do, grounding everything in feel rather than theory. As 1944 pushed on, Rabaul became increasingly isolated. Allied bombing reduced it from a major base to a trapped garrison. Air battles shifted elsewhere. New aircraft entered the fight. New names filled the lists of aces. The incident over the jungle faded into the background of a very loud war. But it never disappeared completely. Years later, long after the Pacific had gone quiet, interviews with surviving pilots occasionally circled back to moments like that one, and not because of numbers shot down, but because of lessons learned. One Marine veteran described it best when he said that combat flying wasn't about being braver than the other guy. It was about being calmer for half a second longer. That half second was everything over Rabaul. The 11 Zeros weren't defeated by superior firepower. They weren't beaten by surprise from above. They were undone by uncertainty, by an enemy who refused to behave, by a pilot who flew his fighter the way he once flew over crops, reading wind, watching spacing, letting impatience destroy precision. The Pacific Air War is often remembered through massive carrier battles and famous aces. But it was also shaped by quiet moments like this, where personal experience bent the edge of doctrine, where a man's past life reached forward and changed how a fight unfolded. In the end, that is why the story still matters. Because it reminds us that technology does not erase human skill, training does not replace instinct, and sometimes the person others underestimate is the one who understands the environment best. Over Rabaul, on a hot morning in March 1944, a Corsair flew low, smooth and calm. 11 enemy fighters followed, expecting an easy victory. What they found instead was confusion, broken timing, and a lesson learned too late. And the laughter never came back. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.